Okay, everyone accepted the recording? Okay. Welcome everyone to our NCOBPS roundtable. This particular roundtable is entitled Reparations, Examining the Necessity of Reparation and Efforts to Heal a Political Genocide. In this particular roundtable, we have Dr. Mychal Odom, Dr. Martin L. Boston, as well as me, Dr. Tiffany Caesar. What I'm going to do is just provide a brief bio of the scholars and activists on this particular panel, and then we will lead into our discussion on reparations. Dr. Mychal Odom is a professor at San Diego State University. His scholarship and community work surrounds the upliftment of the Black community through political organization and organizing and education. He facilitates a podcast called Black Power Talks that profiles contemporary social activists, scholars, and artists who are making a revolutionary impact in Africa and the African diaspora. Dr. Odom's latest publication is The Home of Afro-American Music, Los Angeles and the Creation of Hugh Masekela's Anti-Colonial Sound in the Third World Thematics at TWQ Journal, Special Edition. The movement resonated deep in my soul. New perspectives and pathways to international research of South African social movement, past and present. He is a father and husband who centers his family as a very important part of his life. Dr. Martin L. Boston is an assistant professor of Pan-African Studies and Ethnic Studies at California State University-Sacramento. His specialization include Black diaspora studies, South Africa, African America, exile, cultural production, Pan-Africanism, Black internationalism, comparative racial politics and history, and critical ethnic studies. He recently co-edited a Third World Thematic special issue with Dr. Tiffany Willoughby-Herrard. The movement resonated deep in my soul, new perspectives and pathways to international research of South African social movement, past and present. He also contributed an article in this particular collection called Dawn Breaks, the Anti-Colonial Legacy of the ANC Woman Section radio segment. And me, Dr. Tiffany Caesar, I call myself a Black woman archivist due to my ongoing research on the preservation of transnational Black women leaders and engagement with public history, Queen Mother Moore, Margaret Walker, and Phyllis Dundala. I am an assistant professor in Africana Studies at San Francisco State University. I just published A Journey of a Black Woman Archivist, Phyllis Dundala, Margaret Walker, and Queen Mother Moore, A Quest for a Pan-African Liberation in the Third World Thematics, a TWQ Journal Special Edition. The movement resonated deep in my soul. New perspectives and pathways to international research of South African social movement, past and present. So we all are scholars as well as activists who work within the US as well as abroad in having these particular discussions surrounding reparations. So before we go into the questions, I would like to ask Dr. Odom if he can provide us with a brief historical context of reparations.
Yeah, I really appreciate this panel. I appreciate the opportunity for us to come together to speak about reparations, which of course has become a common household word now within the last few years, especially since the murder of George Floyd, May 25th, 2020. May 25th, 2020 is a remarkable day in the sense that that is also known as African Liberation Day. Since May 25th is known as African Liberation Day, but when we celebrate African Liberation Day and the political activities that I have off campus, we say not yet Uhuru, meaning that we're celebrating African Liberation Day, but understanding that African liberation has not come because Africans are not free and we have so many things dividing us, including the borders that have been codified by groups like the Organization of African Unity, now called the African Union, and other systems and ideas and things like that that divide African people. But nevertheless, as an immediate response to um, the death of George Floyd, we saw people speak of reparations. Reparations, as one which I define it, is just uh, economic compensation for past wrongs. Uh, Given to different aggrieved populations and stuff like that. Of course, reparations can take different forms, not simply financial, but I do think that the financial is an important conversation to be had around reparations because it's a recognition of the colonial relationship between African people and the system, understanding that what gave birth to the wealth and even the consolidation of Europe and Europeans as a people was this assault against African people 600 years ago, in the process through which African people in Africa lost a better life to give a better life to Europe and European people. African people in the Americas, but the United States most specifically, are the only people who did not come here in search of a better life, but because a better life is taken away from us. So when we understand the colonial process as something that seeks to steal the life, labor, and value, or at least the ability for communities to produce life, labor, and value for themselves, and instead they produce life, labor, and value for the colonizing populations, then we understand the importance of reparations. We understand that reparations is something that, though it was called different things, I think mutual support and not mutual support, but I think they called it mutual aid and things like that in the late 19th century. But it's something that Africans had always been striving for. If I'm correct, the earliest of pushes for what we now know as reparations happened even before the end of former slavery in the 1850s, in which a lawsuit was successfully given for some form of compensation to formerly enslaved people. And then after that, we see the different reparations clubs and things like that being crafted for African people to push for compensation. I think very often reparations is seen as a compensation for slavery in itself. And I think that's where we get into some of the limited views with things like African descendants of slavery and the California bill, which says that you have to descend from a slave and stuff like that. When the truth is that still sort of centers the slave master. I like to say that, my partner her family is from Antigua and Barbuda partially, and also Jamaica. Some of the largest slave holders and slave plantations in those areas were actually owned by white North Americans. So you're telling me that a person from Antigua and Barbuda who lives in here in the United States can't seek reparations within the United States? What, they got to take a plane ticket down to the southern part of the Caribbean to fight for the reparations due to them from people here in the United States? No, right? The colonizer population, and then population of enslavers were united internationally. Now we have to be united. Now, just to fast forward, really the largest thrust in the middle of the 20th century was given to the reparations through people like Queen Mother Moore and her Universal Association of Ethiopian Women, as well as campaigns such as the We Charge Genocide campaign, which suggested that it will raise the issue that what African people faced in the United States was genocide. And we also note that reparations have been given to other oppressed populations within the United States, so it's not anything new. Last thing I'll say is the most important event, I would say, in our current reparations fight was a little bit over 40 years ago. You have the World Tribunal for Reparations to African People in the United States, organized by the African People's Socialist Party in Brooklyn, New York, in November 1982. That event had the express purpose of making reparations a household word. And the reason and the way in which they did this was through creation of a mass organization called the African National Reparations Organization, which for the successing 12 years went around the United States and took reparations out there to the population. In 2001, members of the Hoover movement who had started this went to Durban, and they took the call for reparations to Durban, South Carolina, at the Durban Conference on the World Conference on Racism in September 2001, and held subsequently another reparations conference, if I'm correct, the following year. So these things are all important because they were pushing reparations at a time in which people even called it a lunatic fringe, but it was very important because it pulled the reparations conversation away from simply being a legislative conversation or a legal conversation to something that everyday African people talked about and have demanded.
Thank you so much, Dr. Odom, and I really appreciate you bringing in that global perspective at the beginning of the discussion, and how even in the Caribbean countries, we have this complex relationship, right? When it comes to the links to the United States in the form of ownership of land. Dr. Martin, would you like to say anything about reparations before we go into the questions?
No, all I can do is add that I just agree with what Dr. Odom put forth, and I appreciate being here. I think about, I was talking actually to Dr. Odom offline about this the other day. I just could not remember the name of this particular movement, but the Republic of New Africa is another one who has been calling for reparations in the form of land, right? Since 1968, which I thought was an important kind of addition to what Dr. Odom is talking about, kind of this longer history of calling for reparations before these kind of more contemporary conversations, right? And I guess the one other thing I would talk about is that though there has been other aggrieved populations that have received some form of reparations, they've never been substantial in any kind of way. At least they got them, right, in certain kind of ways, right? But the at least they got them narrative is one of the issues, I think, with the conversation around reparations, because the conversation around reparations, like Dr. Odom, I think brilliantly pointed out here, is that it has so much to do with what can get legally passed, right? Or what can get past the legal loopholes. And I think that's one of the reasons, one of the arguments behind descendants of the formerly enslaved being the ones that could get reparations here, if they do get that all done here in California, is because they say it's non-race based, right? It's not race specific. Right, so then it can possibly pass legal jump holes. But now you're just going to forget the whole aggrieved community in which we're talking about because you want to get it through legal channels, which I think is, slightly problematic in those ways. I do understand the idea of, I do understand kind of where some of this idea comes from. It's like the newly emerging immigrant classes from Africa. Only being here 1-2 generations, don't have the same legacy with, those kinds of violences particular to enslavement. But my overall issue, even with that, is if we do calculate a number, right? Everything till this point is going to be calculated in that number, right? So some people would be able to, so the formerly enslaved would be able to, quote unquote, profit off people's suffering in the contemporary moment. So it just gets really complicated. And the overall is like African people in the United States have been harmed to this very moment, right? And there needs to be repair for all of that, right? And I think that's one of the great kind of conversations. I'm sure we'll get more into that as we get into it. But yeah, so I really appreciate where Dr. Odom sets us off, and you, Dr. Caesar, and I'm looking forward to the rest of this conversation.
Dr. Odom, I know you wanted to make another comment.
Yeah. I feel it's important to have this conversation and noting that reparations is also a revolutionary demand, right? And when it's a revolutionary demand, it takes into consideration what we would call the colonial mode of production, right? Marxist theory suggests that capitalism is the way is central to the way through which modern society was produced, and colonialism, therefore, is just, and imperialism is a byproduct of that. But when we center the experience of African people, we understand that colonialism is actually what produced capitalism, and that this essentially makes African claims for reparations vastly different, and therefore a colonial part of essential part of anti-colonial struggle, because it's about reversing that relationship. I mean, of course, the overall opposition to reparations to African people, even in that opposition, we have to see the oppositional form of to that embedded in the African descendants of slave movements and the foundational Black American movement, which I have to say is the fact that they all understand that if true reparations were given, then it would begin a process of really upending that historic relationship that African people and European people have with each other. But that's also why reparations has been taken up even by white people. There's a group called the African People Solidarity Committee, because they understand that the only way forward is to reverse that relationship that African and white people have with each other, and reparations is the way to do that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Odom. I really appreciate you stating that, revolutionary demand, reparation is a revolutionary demand, and that revolutionary demand is not just Black people demanding it, but we also have white people who are demanding reparation for Black people. So to really understand like the complexity that is just not all Black people talking about reparations. And Dr. Martin, I really appreciate that you brought up the Republic of New Africa, because that was a very progressive organization wanting to create sovereignty within the US, right? And that is very important to know when we think of the politics and the way that we create these particular spaces and hold space within this colonial society. Before I go into the questions, I do want to say that, the United Nations advocate for reparations, even have a definition, right? I know that Dr. Odom mentioned Queen Mother Moore, and I always like to say in 1957 with her organization, the United Ethiopian Association, she goes there and she demands 500, I think it was like $200 billion of that amount of money, right? She demands this amount of money for reparations to the UN. So as Dr. Odom, as well as Dr. Moore has already expressed, this is a long conversation. The fact that we are kind of in a heated debate right now, particularly in California, is very significant, but it's very important to understand that this is a conversation that has been happening. And I do just want to read that definition for reparation from the UN. And it states that it refers to measures to redress violations of human rights by providing a range of material and symbolic benefits to victims or their families, as well as affected communities. Reparation must be adequate, effective, prompt, and should be proportional to the gravity of the violation and the harm suffered, right? And so again, it goes into the discussion of it's not just money, right? It's a whole system that has to be redressed when we think about how do we care for these people who have been traumatized and oppressed by this particular system. So with that said, we are going to go into our questions, right? And we have a few questions as we talk about reparations. I would like to start with Dr. Martin. If you can kind of just share what are some of the things you have done in the community and academically to advocate for different forms of reparations?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. So, I've done several things, not enough, right? I think all of us would agree that there's always more that we can do and would like to do. But just recently, in November this year, I put on a panel discussion, a webinar, if you will, talking about Let's Talk Reparations, the necessity for reparations for the Black community, locally, globally, nationally, and internationally. And I brought together a couple of folks to be a part of that conversation. And you talked about just briefly that California is really in a kind of, it's a very hot topic in California right now, talking about reparations. One, because of the reparations task force that was brought to bear by former Chula Vista councilwoman, now Secretary of State of the state of California, Dr. Shirley Weber, also former faculty member in the Africana Studies Department at San Diego State University. She brought to bear California Assembly Bill 3121, which started the task force for the study and development of reparation proposals, right, and for the state of California. And so there's that, but then there's also in San Francisco, they have their own San Francisco African American Reparations Advisory Committee that was started last year as well, that they're also developing recommendations for reparations for those for African Americans in San Francisco, right? For all the different harms that they've inflicted, from police brutality to gentrification, right? So there's a wide array of things that people are feeling aggrieved about, particularly in San Francisco. And there's even a reconciliation, which I'm sure we'll get to talk to more about it. There's like a healing and reconciliation commission for Native folks in the state of California as well. So California really is having a lot of these conversations on multiple levels. But anyway, I digress. So the conversation I kind of brought together the chairperson of that San Francisco African American Reparations Advisory Committee, Eric McDonald, the District 10 supervisor and president of the Board of Supervisors of San Francisco. So San Francisco's second in command behind the mayor, Shaman Walton, was a part of that conversation, and Dr. Boatomo Masupie, who's an associate dean in the College of Social Sciences and Interdisciplinary Studies at California State University-Sacramento, who was an anti-apartheid activist, did a lot of work, and thought through and had conversations and some arguments against the Truth for and against the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that comes out of South African apartheid in 1996, following the first democratic elections in South Africa's history. So I brought together all these people. We had a great conversation, fruitful conversation about all the happenings of reparations. And it actually closed out the last 15 minutes with the current, with the current author of the bill, HR 40, which is calling for the National Commission for the Study of Reparations, that was started in the late 80s by the late Senator Conyers from Detroit, Michigan. But currently that bill is being authored by Houston Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. And she got on for the last 15 minutes and gave a really kind of fiery oration about what it would take for HR 40 and why it's so important for HR 40 to be passed. But it literally has been since the late 80s that thing's been coming up, and it has not been passed, hasn't gotten to the House yet, let alone the Senate, right? So there's lots of kind of uphill battle there in that regard. I heard today that I think it was 17% of white people who have been interviewed about reparations believe that reparations should be given, right? And that's an interesting conversation when you think about reparations, is that it's demanding that the government, white folks, repair what they've done. And that continues to be very much an uphill battle. So that's one of the things I've done. Obviously, I've done a couple of these kinds of panels. So So here at NCOBPS, and I've taught reparations when I was a postdoc at DePaul University. I taught a class called Reparations and Reconciliation, where I was thinking through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa and how it might be a model, or critique it in ways that we can think about reparations actually happening in the United States. I'm posting a similar class right now at Sacramento State. I done radio interviews. Last week I was with CAP Radio, which is NPR affiliate around in the Sacramento area, talking about reparations, Reparation Task Force. I've been interviewed several times by CBS 13 and other kind of radio stations, particularly around the California Reparations Task Force and their findings and their first report and their second report that's due in July here. So I've done several things in that regard, but again, looking to do a lot more around that. So
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Martin. I appreciate it, because I actually went to that panel discussion with Sheila Jackson, the politician, and the various figures representing San Francisco as well as South Africa. I felt that it was a wonderful panel, and it really brought together so many perspectives and really made you think critically about this particular discussion of reparations. So thank you so much for sharing. Dr. Odom, can you share some of the many things that you have done as it concerns reparations?
Yeah, well, one thing I would say is, for a long time I'd studied reparations and the possibility of reparations, and, even the plausibility or whatever and things like that. And, one thing that really changed my whole worldview was the bailout, 2008, right? Because I remember, there's a lot of people I've studied under this guy named Professor Roy Brooks from San Diego. University of San Diego Law School has got this book on atonement as a form of reparations and other sort of models for reparations that aren't always monetary. But then when you look at the bailout to the banks, right? But those banks were funded partially through the investment in slavery and wholly through the investment in colonialism, including a place like Bank of America that invested hundreds of millions of dollars in the 1960s. Which would account to billions of dollars nowadays in South Africa and into housing segregation and things like that. Then you say, okay, look, the number is actually too low. I think it's the United Nations nowadays that say, $14 trillion is owed to people. But what I would say is that, a few years ago, I was the international chair of a campaign called Africans Charge Genocide, really, which is the legacy of the We Charge Genocide campaign, which allowed for, actually we achieved as many as 130,000 signatures on our change.org, a signature calling for the United States government to be charged with the crime of genocide against African people. Connected to that was something we have called the African reparations claim, or reparations certificate, which allow for African people who then and other African people to say, okay, we charge genocide and we demand reparations, and we recognize the organization that I'm a part of as to be the rightful representatives in that struggle. I'm recently became the international chair of an organization called the International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement, which is an international mass movement to fight for the democratic rights of African people around the world. And one of those rights is the right to reparations. It's important to note that this organization that I chair is a successor organization to the African National Reparations Organization. So we've taken up that fight. But that certificate that we have that allow for people to support reparations was actually signed by Mychal Jackson. So Mychal Jackson in the 1980s actually signed one of these African National Reparations Organization certificates, and that we've picked up that process in ourselves. But it's also it's also important to note that this it's also important to note that um, uh, uh, this work has gotten our organization, in the scope of the U.S. government, who at one time, at the same time, says that they support reparations, have tried to charge our organization with just being tools of foreign people, and it's Russians and other people who place this call for reparations in our heads, which is absolutely absolutely foolish. But it's important to bring that forward, especially um, as the demand for reparations goes further. It's also important to note that I operate the Black Power Talks podcast, where we discuss these things. And last year, since it was the 40th anniversary of the Reparations Tribunal, we had a series of conversations on there. One of them including a conversation with you, Tiffany, Professor Caesar, about Queen Mother Moore. And subsequently, as well, as a professor, I bring the question of reparations into my class and have my students really study reparations and then put together the model for creating their own reparations organization.
Thank you so much, Dr. Odom. I really appreciate that. And I really enjoyed Black Power Talks, right? To have these particular spaces where people can share, unfiltered, right, what they're doing in the community to assist with the progression of Black people. And also providing this particular ideal that, what we see now in the bill, right, and in this contemporary legislation started from grassroots movements, right? And that it didn't just come out of, thin air. So thank you so much for that. And so I guess, for me, the work that I'm doing, I want to shout out this panel because we are doing something when we're talking about it and sharing, our knowledge, our experience and thoughts, right, at the National Council of Black Political Scientists. So I'm really big on cultural heritage initiatives. And so as Dr. Odom spoke, I did a podcast on Queen Mother Moore. And so I've been working with the Iberia African American Historical Society to preserve the legacy of Queen Mother Moore in New Iberia, where she was born. And as already mentioned, Queen Mother Moore is one of the founders of the reparation movement. And so for me, it's very important that we preserve the narrative of Black women who are making these particular efforts in a very transnational way. And so last summer, we did a program called Queen Mother Moore Legacy Symposium and Celebration, in which we had key scholars who have done research on Queen Mother Moore, like Dr. Ashley Farmer, who's working on an extensive biography of her, Dr. Ankanyele Umoja, who was actually one of Queen Mother Moore's mentee, and Dr. Cassie Turnipseed, who works on cultural heritage initiatives in the South, talk about the importance of preserving her legacy. This summer, we will be doing a marker, right? And so reparations for me is also about remembering who the people are and making sure we say their name. I also do programming. And so I had the opportunity to invite with Dr. Odom, as well as other California-based scholar, activists, and politicians to the San Francisco Public Library. So I work with the African American Center at the San Francisco Public Library. It was a joint program with the library and the Africana Studies department at San Francisco State University to do a discussion on reparation. And again, our goal was to provide this broad discussion because sometimes people, as you all mentioned, people may think that reparation is only money, right? Or it's only centered in the US, but I really wanted us to see the various discussions and perspectives to critically think about reparations. So I had Dr. Odom there. I had Bakari Alatunje, who is the West Regional Representative for the Uhuru Movement, and the Vice Chair of Uhuru Foods and Pies in Oakland. There was Brittany Chikwata, who's the Director of the Economic Rights and the San Francisco Human Rights Commission, which is also a key figure in the San Francisco draft for reparation. And we had Reverend Arnold Townsend, who is a leading advocate for the preservation of Black communities in San Francisco, and Ross Nganga, who is an African-centered mental health advocate, right, who talked about reparations from the point of your mind and the trauma that occurs. And so that was a really great way. I really believe that you have to bring these conversations to the public, as you, Dr. Martin, as well as Dr. Odom have spoken about. I've also had the opportunity to write about it in my last article, A Journey of a Black Women's Archivist, Phyllis Ndala, Margaret Walker, and Queen Mother Moore, where I talk about Queen Mother Moore as being a part of a cohort of Black women who are really fighting for freedom and fighting for equality for Black people. And I wrote kind of like I guess you could say an op-ed for a newspaper in Lafayette called Queen Mother Moore's Racial Solidarity, when reconciliation was not enough. So, they asked me to write something about racial reconciliation. And I'm like, what? I can't necessarily talk about that per se, but what I can talk about is efforts of racial solidarity. And, I talked about reconciliation in the sense of what New Iberia is doing as a biracial city to try to honor such a political radical figure like Queen Mother Moore. And also, like both of you all said, I teach it in my class, Introduction to African American History, as well as Black Lives Matter. And matter of fact, my students, I make them come to see Professor Odom and all the others speak about reparations, because it's different, right, to read about it. But when you actually see it in real time, I believe it can kind of click differently. So those are some of the things that I've done on my journey of advocacy, and I'm still growing and I'm still learning. So, all right, so I'm gonna go on to question number 2. How is reparations a form of healing for racial trauma, thinking of it as a way to heal political genocide? And I would like to start with Dr. Odom on that question.
Well, one debate that exists, not just in social sciences and things like that, or the political world more broadly, but even in the African community, is what's the relationship between consciousness and lived experience, right? The reason I said that is because so many people just, PSI, positive self-identity, representation, and things like this, if you know better, you do better type deal, is which really is a contradictory, because it's really a sort of Cartesian philosophy in which people believe that the mind over matter. I think it was Rene Descartes who says, I think therefore I am. But we see political activists all the way to poet and scholar activists such as Audre Lorde, who challenges that and says, no, right, it's the feeling, it's the condition which inform our existence. So I feel, therefore, I can do, and stuff like that is important. The reason why I say that is because, when you got to decide this question of racial trauma and stuff like that, and what can reparations do about racial trauma, first we have to underscore the fact that racial trauma itself isn't just something that exists within our minds, but it's the result of the conditions of being colonized, being enslaved, being forcefully alienated from our homeland, and the fact that a better way of life was taken away from us. So at the end of the day, Africans can't overturn the trauma that we have without overturning the conditions on which African people live, because anything short of that is really the definition of mental illness and insanity. And stuff like that. So reparations as a material response to the oppression of African people is absolutely central to overturning that trauma.
I absolutely love that answer, and it really makes me think of the original or how you prefaced us, Dr. Caesar, when you were talking about the UN's definition. And those two terms that I just can't get out of my mind since you read that. And it was one, timely, which is funny, right? And then second, and this really kind of profound, is proportionate, right? It had the word proportionate in that definition. That's what reparation would look like, proportionate. Now, how do we, what is the proportion of theft of a people, severance from their past, present, and future, with part of secular ventrum, and the child followed the mother in the ways of slavery, of title, of those kind of things. So not only did you not have access to your past and where you came from, you did not own yourself, so you didn't have your present, and you couldn't even own or have any idea of where your future is. What is proportional for that for 250 years, right? And generations of that kind of trauma, right? What is proportional for another 150 of legal, or 100 years of legalized Jim Crow, and another 50 to 100 years of just, of that kind of trauma? What is proportionate to what Du Bois called double consciousness, or Kimberly Crenshaw because, intersectionality and the kinds of intersectional oppressions that folks feel from different modes of being, or collective consciousness. Like, there's so many ways in which people have come to this question of what is happening with our people. How are we not only literally feeling, but as Dr. Odom said, like how has these structures and systems produced our lived experience, right? And the ways in which we actually are able to live our lives. So yes, there's a wealth gap. And if you give me my money, that wealth gap can be closed, but that does not change all the other, the proportions of what the trauma actually is so astronomical that some people use that as a way of, okay, so we can't do it at all, right? And that's not the answer either. Because repair is action, right? And that's the other thing about reparations. So many people think of it as a one-time payout or just an instant, like it's a moment, right? Once reparations here and the transaction is transactionary, it's done, right? Instead of colonialism as a maintained system, right? People have to start thinking of reparations as a proportionate. We have to start thinking of reparations as a maintained system. It must take at least the amount of time in which the injury took to occur. So minimum of 400 years of reparation, right? In all these different aspects. So that's why when you read that definition, it was just so fascinating and so important to me. Because timely, we're talking about 400 years later, and at least, right? And that's at least. And then you're talking about proportionate. And when you think about how big that proportion is, not just the financial toll, not just the stolen labor or property or redlining or mental health or inability to access higher education or social services, so on and so forth. There's that, but then just so I think that UN definition was really, really important for this question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martin. And I really appreciate this emphasis on what is proportional, right? Because I don't think that people understand the gravity, of the centuries of oppression. And so if it's centuries of oppression, then, whatever is given to the Black population, it should be proportional. And Dr. Odom, I really like you said that racial trauma is the result of, right? It didn't just, come out of thin air, right? It's the result of this ongoing oppression, discrimination, and violence, right? That African descended people had went through, continue to go through. For me, I want to talk about Queen Mother Moore and her theory that she created, because many people don't know that, you know, she was a theorist, right, as well as a political figure. So she theorized about the condition of Black people politically as well as psychologically, and she talked about this ideal called or the term called psychosis neurosis. And she says psychosis is a condition that led Blacks to act against their interests and engender fidelity to their oppressors. It's a form of denaturalization, othering, and acting outside of oneself. Queen Mother Moore described it as a tame lion in a circus. So this idea, this particular ideal of the centuries of oppression, it impacts the way people identify, right? And when it impacts the way you identify with yourself, it causes internal turmoil that makes you do things that are not advantageous for your survival. And Dr. Joy DeGruy talks about the post-traumatic slave syndrome, and that's a way in which African Americans adapted, right, to the centuries of oppressions. And she said that it's a transgenerational adaptation. Transgenerational, which goes into this idea of like what is proportional and the result of, right? Transgenerational adaptation associated with the past traumas of slavery and ongoing oppression. She says it's in our DNA. Okay, so how do you fix that, right? And it's triggered by laws and policies that enforces people of color overtly and covertly. Reparation is not just about money, as we discussed. It is providing resources in general and assisting Black people with tools they need to live in America. And then when we think of particularly of San Francisco, when you read the San Francisco reparation draft, they don't just talk about the $5 million lump sum that's getting the most publicity, but they also talk about affordable housing and ownership, elevation and support of Black businesses, educational support and incentives, closing the gap between health disparities, as well as addressing the historical and existing state policies that have disproportionately, right, harmed San Francisco African-American communities. So thinking about it on a broader term, when we think of racial trauma and healing, it kind of goes back to this thing of, what is proportional? Like, how do you do this and why? And to understand the extent of the results of, colonialism. So the next question, because I know our time's ticking, is, can reparations truly be a part of integration in this land of democracy? Thinking of how our efforts to create sovereignty or liberated spaces have been constantly attacked or destroyed. So I know that Dr. Martin, you kind of spoke about it. You spoke about like the Republic of New Africa, right? Who was trying to create sovereignty within the US. So do you mind like speaking, what are your thoughts? Can this actually happen in the US?
I would love to talk about this, but I promise you, I think we're going to get the good start from Brother Odom. So I would like, if it's not too much, I would like with Dr. Odom.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate this question. I think there's a couple of things that stand out. First off, the question of integration, the question of democracy as well, and sovereignty within the United States. I think the central question, I think that the RNA, as they were created in 1968, represented an important thrust forward in our move towards independence, especially with the fact that they came out of a group of people who had direct connections with Malcolm X, organizing with Malcolm with his message to the grassroots conference and other things like that. So with the assassination of Malcolm and things like that, they represented an important legacy of that work, as well as going back towards Garvey. I do think, however, though, that there are some important limits in imagining freedom for Black people bound within a series of states in the United States that were stolen from indigenous people, regardless of, I know that, it's something that has been latched upon. I think that really their ideas of New Africanism is sort of the outgrowth of a 1928 black belt thesis put forward by the International Communist Party and stuff like that. But I do think that true freedom for African people will be when Africa is free. But I do think that African people outside of Africa should be fighting for what we understand as liberated territory, or even what the Soviets or the USSR understood as Soviets, which are sort of Soviets themselves aren't independent states, but they are workers' councils, which work towards the creation of this international united state of or nation of workers and stuff like that. So I think that Africans in North America for sure should be fighting, but as an American front of the international African struggle. The ideology that I bring forward is one of African internationalism, where I don't think that slavery or something like that created us as a new group of people, but instead, um, but you talk about this question of democracy, right? This is a place of democracy, but what we're really engaged in is a struggle over the meaning of democracy. So in many ways, African liberation is a struggle for democracy against democracy, right? And what we have is a colonial democracy. What we have is the understanding that in 1965 they assassinated Malcolm X, and then they passed the Voting Rights Act, which then says that, and then 3 years later they assassinated Martin Luther King. And so basically, you get to vote, but not in your own interest. And that is a concern. So what I would also lastly say is that there is a struggle, right? Some people will use reparations in their quest for integration, but there's a document called the Tactics and Strategies pamphlet of sorts. It has a longer name, but it's written by Omali Yeshitela in 1977. It was presented at Amherst University Black Organizers Conference, where people like Max Stanford, also known as Ahmed, Muhammad, Ella Baker was there. Robert Williams, also Republic of New Africa, was there, and stuff like that. And in this, Omali Yeshitela outlines what he defines integrationism as anti-independence, right? And this is important because too often, when the United States broke away from England, they called that independence. But when African people break away from the colonial system, they call it separatism. But it's not separatism, right? It's about sort of finding an independence for African people and eventually creating a new way through which people around the world can relate to each other. Now, the contradiction we have now is some people want repair for slavery to be just another way to invite African people into the world as it exists right now. That's what happened in South Africa, right? Essentially a neo-colonial repair to the crimes of the past. I think the struggle now is for us to define what democracy looks like for ourselves. My organization, we say self-determination is the highest form of true democracy, and then use the reparation struggle for us to aim in that way as a form of self-determination for our own people.
Yeah, so I'll just briefly add, because I wholeheartedly agree with what Dr. Odom says. But when I think about, is this possible, right? Is reparations possible? Well, I think like Dr. Odom said earlier, he said, thinking about 2008 and the bailouts, yes, the money's there, it's possible, right? I heard Shirley Weber say that, oh no, California has the fourth highest economy in the world. Not like, I'm talking about world, like countries, right? Like California itself has the fourth highest economy in the world. So absolutely, right? Can the California task force make reparations happen for Black people in California, which is like 13% of California? Absolutely, 100%. They can pay them what they're owed. It can absolutely happen. You think about how much money we spend on war, right? On the war machine, absolutely, we can spend that money, and so the money part, absolutely, it can be done. The larger questions of, what I say, continual repair. We're talking about proportionate, 400 years of continually to struggle against a colonial history. It would be much more of a consciousness raising thing that I think would be more challenging. Not impossible, but more challenging nonetheless. Final thing I would say, because you brought up TRC, Truth and Reconciliation, the overall issues with Truth and Reconciliation is that they did a great job kind of memorializing, remembering. All those things are important for healing, right, for transition, but they did not get to the reconciliation part, right? There was no wealth redistribution. De Beers still owns all the diamonds, right? They didn't, take over industry and get those things back to the native people. So there's ways in which you can think of Truth and Reconciliation as a model for some forms of things that we want to see, but there's also very hard critiques that the Born Free generation, for instance, has been very critical of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission since, because that's why Fees Must Fall happens in 2015, right? Why is there a larger wealth gap between individuals in South Africa than there was when the National Party was in power, right? So there's all these questions that are going on, but that was just the one thing I was thinking about, is if it could be implemented. Absolutely.
Thank you so much. And I just want to agree with both you and Dr. Odom as on these particular ideas. For me, I'm not very optimistic, right? I'm not going to lie. Right here in California, Black students score the lowest on state tests, and they're not given resources because the ban on affirmative action, right? That's supposed to provide, that was created to provide these additional resources for schools of color. And so it's kind of like, it makes me think of like the Reconstruction period, in which, Black people are given this advancement and it's taken away. I hope, right? I hope something comes out of it, but the way that I see things historically, I just don't know. So thank you so much, Dr. Odom and Dr. Martin, for further expressing this complexity, the relationship, and really critically thinking about what is democracy and democracy for who. The last question centers around this particular idea of the CSU ban. We all are working in the CSU system, respectively, San Diego State University, California State University-Sacramento, as well as San Francisco State University. And so there is a ban on particular states under the Assembly Bill of 1887. And it says that basically California must take action to avoid supporting or financing discrimination against lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. To that end, AB 1887 prohibits a state agency, department, board, or commission from requiring any state employees, officers, or members to travel to a state. So I just kind of want, because some of the reasons why, we are recording this particular panel is because we couldn't get funding, or if we could get funding, we had to go through red tape because of the bureaucratic policy and legislation within this bill. So I wanted you all to kind of talk about, what do you feel this bill means in the context of reparation?
Could you just read like the last part of that? It said something with regards to won't require employees to go. What was that?
So it says, to that end, AB 1887 prohibits a state agency, department, board, or commission from requiring. any state employees, officer, or members to travel to.
Yeah, because the way I understood it was that it banned us from, but it just says that you can't require them to go. That's interesting. Maybe I'm just reading into that wrong.
Well, it's specific to supporting or financing. So I do think that there is a lot of question on, at least the way it's been interpreted, that like, our travel to those states will not be reimbursed. And we're all the way on the other side of the United States. But we also know that, we're here on the other side of the United States because of the historic oppression that has happened to our families down south. And then and then bills like the state Senate bill or the local reparations initiatives taking place throughout California are recognition that Africans did not receive better treatment when they came here. Instead, in places like San Francisco and Oakland, white people, the average middle, even what they might call middle class, live at a rate of 5, 6, 7, 8 times the amount of not just wealth, but yearly income, with Black people falling somewhere within an average of 30-something thousand dollars a year, and white people in the Bay Area falling somewhere to the upwards of $250,000 a year. And not everybody works in Silicon Valley. This including white bus drivers and ditch diggers and stuff like that. So the point here is that there's such a wealth of research going on by African people in the U.S. South, and in some form of supposed solidarity with other aggrieved communities. We really see limits being placed on the research and the possibilities and the professional advancement of African people who live out here, Africana studies researchers who live out here, from attending and participating in important conferences such as NCOBPS by themselves. So, hopefully that sort of gives it. I know I can say more about it, but I want you to go say, if you can say a little bit more, Martin.
Oh, no, so I completely agree, because NCOBPS currently right now is in Atlanta, Georgia, and we're doing this over here because of the ways in which funding works out, and it wouldn't allow us to go to Georgia. And it's funny because didn't Georgia or Atlanta just save democracy a little bit ago? Didn't that just happen? Right? And we can't travel to Georgia to participate in a conversation about reparations and to build with other thinkers who are thinking about the contradictions of the relationship between the American South and the fact that so many of our families are based in the South. My mother lives in Georgia, right? And my mother is a part of saving democracy, right? And my sister, right? And to be able to go to cities like Atlanta, who were vehemently against what the majority of the state passed, right, runs into some of those contradictions that we have the issue, right? I missed the American Studies Association conference, was in New Orleans because of the same kind of issues. And New Orleans is a much different city than, the the rest of the boot, right? The outskirts of the boot, right? And that raises questions about kind of who in the state are we trying to, take it to? You know what I mean? Even if it's lawmakers or their constituency, we again are kind of we fall out of this conversation, and the researchers that are doing this kind of work fall out of that conversation.
I totally agree. I totally agree. We fall off the conversation. Prior to this discussion, me and Dr. Odom had a conversation about intersectionality, right? And this ideal of, trying to provide support, for an oppressed group. You're still not really supporting the Black LGBTQ community, who are scholars, and so how do you create laws and policies that are not oppressive in this form of way of trying to support people, right? And marginalized communities.
Well, this goes back to the question and the response I had to the question of integration, right? The truth is that what we have going on in California and all throughout the United States, first off, you have to understand that the social system is in crisis, right? And in moments of imperialist crisis, uh, the system can't operate how it used to. So it's trying to find new ways to operate. Well, the system wants new ways to operate while maintaining the the general functioning of the operating system, right? This is, why I, in my own classes, I'm in a classroom right now, try to explain to people the difference between the base and the superstructure, and that the superstructure can be reformed to support the base. Laws exist as a part of the superstructure, right? And what we have going on here is that the superstructure is attempting to reform itself to support the base. So it can allow certain aspects of inclusion as long as it does not overturn that relationship. I mean, but to be just completely blunt, this law is not written with concern of Black people, whether they be LGBTQ or straight, same gender loving or not. It's written in forms of white people. It reminds me a lot of this backlash against the World Cup. Wealthy white people complaining that they can't go to the World Cup in Qatar because of how Qatar does things. Well, stay in England. You know what I mean? Like you should have did 600 years ago, and we wouldn't have the problems that we have now. So yeah, that is part of the contradiction that we see taking place now. Is that so if look, there's a lot of ways to which over the last 30 plus years we've moved away from Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality paper. I feel like even practically she's kind of moved away from it. But in the case studies that she presented in the intersectionality paper, what she's basically saying is that there's a way through which to resolve the previous contradictions in society that were brought up by way of the women's movement and the civil rights movement. Um, uh, they said, okay, now women can work at this factory, and Black men can work at this factory, and Black women are still left out. But people imagine that, like, some sort of progress has been brought to society. For me, that's the importance of centering the colonial question, because when you center the question of colonialism and even what we face still, reviving in my own work a form of understanding that what African people face here in the United States is still a form of domestic colonialism that did not die with the overthrow of the Black Power movement. Then we can understand what needs to be done. First off, when you got to center Black people and all of our experiences in whatever meaningful reforms are trying to be put in place. Because if not, then the reforms will be just used against us. I know that one person referred to this as embedded racism and stuff. I think Omi and Wanat and others refer to this as embedded racism. I think it's deeper than that, but I do think that the idea that, look, the colonial policy can take place, even, or some people might call it racism without racist. To me, that's colonialism, right? Let's us know that you don't need bigoted people at the top. You don't need a Bull Connor for the because what we're talking about shared relations of production. You can have a new social system put in place, and African people still share the same relations to production in society and power in society that they had in the earlier form of that social system.
Thank you so much. I agree with what both of you all said, and I'm just going to make a quick comment before we wrap it on up, because we know this conversation can go on and on. I want to say that I'm here at San Francisco State University. I'm in the College of Ethnic Studies in Africana Studies. And in the 1960s, we had the Black Student Union, right, who protested, right, with other students and community organizers and participants to advocate for a College of Ethnic Studies and Africana Studies. And you know where their parents were from. Their parents were from the South, right? And so, you know, by creating these bans, you're also kind of dismissing this historical relevance of Southern states in the creation of very important departments like Africana Studies and colleges as well. And so I know I was talking to Dr. Odom earlier. It was like, when they created this, did anybody say, what about the Black people? And what about the Black people contribution towards, you know, California, right? You know, particularly as we think of the educational system, the higher educational system. And on that note, I say reparations for Black scholars in California, okay?
I mean, let me just, because this is absolutely correct. So here's the deal. I know Martin and I know a sister named Shamel Bell. Shamel, you might know Shamel. Shamel is working on, I think they call it the Debt Collective or something like that. You know, you hear a lot of people now want to talk about how Black women are the most educated and stuff like that. And without a doubt, right? You know, sisters are doing it. But sisters are doing it because of student loans and stuff like that. And the average Black woman has anywhere between $75,000 and $200,000 in loans, right? And stuff like that. So that means that you know, sisters get a job at some of these schools, and they are not taking home the same paycheck that their white colleagues are taking home. So you can fill your whole department with brilliant African sisters, and they are brilliant. I mean, sisters like you are absolutely brilliant. But if they got to send $1,000 of their money back, people who deserve reparations have to pay the United States government for our own advancement. I mean, that is what we're talking about. We're not just talking about people living in poverty. We're talking about people living in debt. That's poverty plus, you know, and stuff like that. So we have to understand that contradiction when we talk about reparations to Black scholars, you know, which is absolutely correct.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martin and Dr. Odom. I have really enjoyed this conversation, and I think we all agree that we need to talk more collectively.
Completely agree. Completely agree.
When we come to these particular topics. So I do want to wrap up, and I would like to see if any one of you all wanted to say or had any last comments on this particular discussion.
No, I mean, I don't know, because it's not a whole bunch of time left, so there's not a whole bunch more to be said. I think this is a good starting place. It's a conversation that can continue to be had, should be had at every single conference. So I thank NCOBPS for having us and allowing our roundtable to happen. And I hope that more of these conversations continue to happen. I hope to continue these conversations with you all. And I'm glad that we have this special issue that's coming out very soon, and the work that we're all doing together. And I hope we continue to do that work together. So yeah, just happy to be with y'all.
Yeah, and also I want to say this is the 55-year anniversary of a protest that took place led by John Henrik Clarke at the African Studies Association, and the creation of what was called the African Heritage Studies Association. This is the 55-year anniversary of the publication of what was called of Pedagogy of the Press, as well as Walter Rodney's The Groundings with My Brothers. This is 55 years. All of those moments really embark upon what our convening around this journal that we put together, as well as this panel here, which really is the role of African intellectuals in the world. And what I would say is this, you know, the role of intellectuals in any given society is to solve the problems of that society, necessarily the problems of production. And when we understand that African people were colonized and we've been forced for 600 years to solve the problems of production for Europe, that Europe was living a bad life, and that they made a better life for themselves by way of the colonization of and enslavement of African people, and even the African genius, not just our African genius as professors, but the genius of our ancestors who literally built those slave plantations. I tell people, look, no, these things they did not contract this stuff out to some people from Scotland. African people made all those things, and those plantations still are standing, right? The gates. I mean, there's Sankofa images built into the gates, of those plantations. The art, the textiles, all this stuff created by African people, African genius, but for their production. I think that sort of part of the process of us freeing ourselves is us doing stuff like this and solving the problems of production, the production of life, labor, and value for African people and ourselves. And that's our duty. And I think that we are responding to that duty with this panel.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Martin and Dr. Odom. I do want to shout out again the Third World Thematics, a TWQ Journal Special Edition that was edited by Dr. Martin Boston, as well as our current president, right, of NCOBPS, Dr. Tiffany Willoughby-Herrard. And the name of that special edition is "The Movement Resonated Deep in My Soul, New Perspectives and Pathways to International Research of South African Social Movement, Past and Present," and that this particular special edition is also a part of the reparation movement and advocacy of it on an international level. Again, this panel was called Reparations, Examining the Necessities of Reparation and Efforts to Heal a Political Genocide. You would not hear, this is not the last discussion, right? You will hear us, we will write about it. We will continue to do programming about it. So again, thank you, Dr. Odom and Dr. Martin, for participating on this conversation, this dialogue, very critical dialogue. And I want to send you much positivity, support, and encouragement on your journey. Thank you all so much.
Much love.
Thank you. Much love. Thanks for everything.